celebration of the work of Algis Mickūnas, and it has been a privilege and pleasure to know his friendship for some 35 years. When I reread his Technology and Democracy and Communication books that I've done with Joe, I found that I had very little to object to or add to, and so I began thinking about the compulsion to silence and solitude, which is what I want to present today. In La Paz, Ken and I met Celso, short and stocky, maybe 45, with a crown of dense black hair he parted in the middle. He had a four-wheel drive. We spent a couple of weeks with him wandering the Altiplano in Bolivia. The central Andes splits into two mountain chains, and between the high plateau extends 800 kilometers long and on average 130 kilometers wide, an area twice that of Spain, averaging 3,750 meters above sea level. On one side rises the Great Wall of the Cordillera Occidental, rising to 6,500 meters, a chain of dormant volcanoes and solfataras, volcanic vents emitting sulfurous gases. On the other side, the Cordillera Oriental, where Earth's crust had been lifted to 6,400 meters, such as that it faces the Altiplano in steep cliffs. The whole Altiplano is above the tree line. Over vast stretches, there is no vegetation at all, just a flat expanse of the Altiplano and the mountains in giant pores and heaps of black, crimson, rose, cream, ochre, white minerals, as the continent had looked under the unfiltered ultraviolet rays of the sun before the first lichens and mosses inched out of the oceans. Celso was Aymara, but spoke clear Spanish that we could understand, but he was mostly silent. He drove us to a sizzling volcano, and below it a big lake, cobalt blue, with the minerals dissolved in it. Then in another 100 kilometers, a volcano and its lake, jade green. Then an acid red lake, the winds finger painting with the colors. Like no lakes we had ever seen, we walked their lengths with nothing to say. In a blue-green lake, there were hundreds of pink flamingos. At a place Celso called Sol de Mañana, geysers, bubbling mud pots, swirls of steaming sulfurous fumaroles. He drove us across the Salar de Uyuni, an enormous gleaming lake of hard salt, more than 150 kilometers long, its utterly flat surface cut in hexagonal tiles. In the cloudless sky, the sunlight was like radiation. When the sun set, the black and cold of outer space descended. We tried to imagine the continental plate collisions that hoisted the Andes and the Altiplano to such heights. But Ken had read that the continental plates drift at the rates fingernails grow. Now, as most of the time then, the only sound was the haunted rush of the wind telling us no messages. Occasionally in the distance we caught sight of Mickūnas, like small alpacas with the finest fur in the world. They glanced quickly at us and raced away. Weeks of silence and solitude. Then in the far south, Celso drove us to a city. Across the desert plains in the distance we saw a mountain, the Cerro Rico, Celso said. It rose in a symmetrical cone, looking serene and spiritual as Mount Fuji. The mountain from which in 2 centuries, 45,000 tons of pure silver were extracted, 60% of all the silver mined in the world. In 1570, Ming China converted from paper money to silver and began massively importing silver from Mexico and from the Cerro Rico, 150 tons annually via Europe and 50 tons annually via Manila. The galleons returned full of Chinese silk, tea, spices, and porcelain. For the first time, a truly global economy was launched, producing manufacture for export, urbanization, and financial interdependence between Europe, America, and Asia. In 1572, the city of Potosí was laid out at the base of Cerro Rico at an altitude of 4,000 meters. 30 years later, its population, Spanish, Creole, but also French, German, Italian, Portuguese, English, was greater than Madrid or London, and certainly richer. Here the silver-rich lived in fabled luxury, the city filled with mansions and ballrooms, churches and theaters. The cobblestones in the city center were pulled up and replaced with silver bars. In this great city, isolated on the Altiplano, where wealth had put 3 continents in global communication, they lived intensely social lives in ballrooms, theaters, and taverns, in civic celebrations and religious festivals. In 1572 also, the Viceroy Francisco de Toledo instituted La Ley de la Mita, which required all Indians over 18 to work 12-hour shifts in the mines and eat and sleep underground for 4 months at a time. So many died from collapses of tunnels, noxious gases, pulmonary silicosis, and mercury poisoning that the Spanish began importing African slaves. 200 years later, the mines were depleted and closed in 1783. The city quickly depopulated. By 1825, it was reduced to 8,000 people. 50 years later, mining began for tin. Gradually, the city has filled again, now to 200,000. UNESCO has listed Potosí as a World Heritage Site. We spent several days in Potosí, chewing coca to neutralize dizziness from the altitude, and exploring the streets made narrow and crooked to break the icy winds that roar through the city, visiting awestruck the grandiose churches and theaters and the great mint. We did not speak with any of the people in the streets. We wondered where they buried the tens of thousands of Indians and African slaves. In the city, we were alone, surrounded by the ghosts of the dead, unable to make contact with them. Then we happened upon the Convento de Santa Teresa. The guide took 3 hours to show us this Carmelite convent founded in 1685. The Discalced Carmelites, she explained, were founded by the Spanish mystics Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. The convents never harbored more than 21 nuns. This convent was for women from noble families. She showed us a door where the young woman was brought by her family, divested of her fine clothing, her head shaven, and clad in the rough wool habit. She would never see her family again. When they visited once a month, she would greet them from behind a grill covered with black cloth. The Discalced Carmelites are a contemplative order. They lived in silence, speaking but 2 hours a day while working the gardens and weaving. The guide showed us the unheated cell where the nun slept on a bed of boards without mattress or mat, and where she prayed kneeling on the stone floor. We were shown room after room of religious paintings that would honor any national museum. We were shown room after room of church vestments woven, brocaded, and embroidered by the nuns. On them flowers that emerged by themselves in the brief rains from the rocky soil of their walled gardens were glorified in the most delicate forms and subtle hues. With the decline of the city, the convent too had been emptied. But some years ago, 5 nuns, 4 from Bolivia and 1 from Brazil, have come here and live in the cloistered part of the building. Here, in the midst of the biggest and richest city of the world, women from the richest families had withdrawn into solitude and contemplation of another vaster, unseen reality. These women, long dead, and those now in the convent unseen, somehow beckon to us in our solitude. Language represents things and events. This word, representation, has to be understood in a special way. It does not simply function as a representation that is a diagram of things and events that are or were present. Our utterances about our environment do things to things and events, indicating things and events, focusing in on them, separating them from the continuous flow of the perceptual field, questioning them, questioning if they exist or what and how they exist, exclaiming our surprise or fear or wonder about them, doubting whether they are as they appear, grouping them with other things and events. With our words, things and events that were enmeshed and passing in the continuous flow of the environment about us come into relief. Our words cast into the air take hold of them. There's a hyena over there. How agitated that bird is. It looks like a puddle of water on the road, but it is instead a layer of light. There's another guy acting suspiciously on the subway. Our words make things and events present and repeatedly present. The great shared narratives of a community, its myths, are the primordial language that first articulates, extends, and reveals the world, the forces and the powers, the dimensions of space, the gods, the origin of the people, the duration of time. But language also separates us from the environment, forms a screen before the environment, or functions as blinders or filters attached to our organs of perception. Every researcher in biology, medical pathology, psychiatry knows that he or she has to put aside the way things and events are described and analyzed to look with one's own eyes. We've all felt a need to break through the screen of language, to go see for ourselves the Baltimore slums, Finnish Lapland, or the Sahara. Some sociologists of knowledge, cultural historians, and philosophers have accepted that language is our prison house, and that all that is to be done is to analyze the paradigms that govern scientific, political, and literary discourse in different regions and times. Some of us go to countries and landscapes we know nothing about to encounter them without words. How often, when we have experienced the grandest and most overwhelming things, we find that we have no words. There are no words to describe them. No two humans have the same fingerprints or the same structure of the iris of their eyes. No two leaves in the forest are identical. The vibrancy of light constantly shifts. Our restless eyes cannot hold still. No appearance is the same from one moment to the next. But words exist in repetition. A sound or a visual mark that could never be repeated could not function as a word. Words designate not what is individual, but what is similar in things and events, their general shape, their general color and tone, features that they share with other things and events. Words drop the particular, the singular, to designate the general lines of classes and series of things and situations. Yukio Mishima observed that words, like nitric acid poured on the copper plate, eat away at the substance of things, leaving but their beautiful skeletons. What we designate with words are the skeletons of things in chains. However completely a building or a person has been described to us, the moment we face that building or are face to face with that person, there is shock, astonishment, and discovery. Words do not simply direct attention to what is present and visible. They refer to things and situations in their absence. They situate what is present in a class or series of things and events that have passed on or are anticipated. Every name survives its owner. Julius Benway is dead, but his name is still there, intact, functioning as it did when he was alive. Indeed, when he was alive, his name functioned as it will when he is dead. Each statement survives its object. Nothing changes in the meaning or the truth of the statement. Elspeth went to Reno and got a facelift after Elspeth returned to the Hamptons, nor after she died. Words which condense the complex colors of a pheasant or an evening cloud, which drag over upon situations, names, and classifications from other situations, only the general lines of which are designated, enable us to quickly pass over things and situations, to skim over reality. When I recognize a strange bird as a sparrow, W. Percy notes, I tend to dispose of the bird under its appropriate formulation. It's only a sparrow. Words solidify, encrust the things upon which they are attached. Once something is named, a porcupine fish, a mongrel dog, a rogue lion, a shack, a professor, or a wife, he or she is barnacled, plasticized by that name. Sounds uttered are words that have meaning because they are repeatable, but words empty of their meaning simply by being repeated. They lose their edge, their force, their solemnity, or their lilt and brightness, and they also empty of their meaning. The most universally accepted principles, judgments, and values are the most empty of meaning. Thoughts thought too much no longer think anything, Maurice Merleau-Ponty said. What is emptier than the watchwords freedom, democracy, virtue? Words too often repeated weaken and die, E.M. Sioran writes. The mind should have an infinite dictionary, but its means are limited to a few expressions trivialized by use. Hence the new, requiring strange combinations, forces words into unexpected functions. Originality reduces to the torment of the adjective and the suggestive impropriety of metaphor. An anticipated word is a defunct one. Only its artificial use imbues it with new vigor until it is commonly adopted, worn, corrupted. If man invents new physics, it is not so much to arrive at a valid explanation of nature as to escape the boredom of the understood, habitual, vulgarly irreducible universe, to which he arbitrarily attributes as many dimensions as we project adjectives upon an inert thing that we are tired of seeing and enduring, as it was seen and endured by the stupidity of our ancestors or of our immediate predecessors. A child does not invent language. He or she picks up what things are called, how to respond to events from others. Words and phrases are picked up from others, passed on to others. The way things are designated, the ways they are related, the predicates, the evaluations and judgments put on things and situations are picked up from others, passed on to others. They line up our perceptions, organize our day and its tasks. We view things as others view them, and we respond to things and events as others respond to them. Communicating with words, we put ourselves in the place of others, put others in our place, take ourselves to be equivalent and interchangeable with others. Claude Lévi-Strauss called attention to the reduction of complexity, reduction of diverse organizations, reduction of energy, entropy that occurs in communication between individuals. Every verbal exchange, every line printed, he wrote, establishes communication between people, thus creating an evenness of level, where before there was an information gap and consequently a greater degree of organization. Conversation assimilates and generalizes, accumulates commonplaces, comforts, and anesthetizes. People who talk all the time strike us as shallow. Jean-Jacques Rousseau spoke with exasperation of thought and feeling slipping away while making conversation at a social gathering. Its progress, he wrote, more rapid than my ideas, forcing me almost always to speak before thinking, has often suggested to me stupidities and ineptitudes that my reason disapproved and my heart disavowed the moment they escaped from my mouth, but which preceding my own judgment could not be reformed by its censure. Launched into conversation, the words, sequences, anecdotes, repartees, and the civilized, witty but polite rhetoric that governs them scuttle on and pull us from any real insight we may have, and from the uneasiness, attractions, desires, lusts, anxiety, mounting pleasure of our bodies. Because the words do not attach to the singular apparition or event, but designates what is common to a succession of past and future apparitions or events, words detach from things and events. They can then be arranged willfully to misrepresent, to lie. We daily resort to the polite conventions, stock phrases, evasions that cover over what we see, what we in fact see and touch. Men have language, Voltaire said, in order to conceal their thoughts. We do not only pick up and pass on what others say, we also speak of ourselves. As for me, I think, I object to what you say. I am just bored by what you are saying. I have deep feelings about that. It's what we call self-consciousness. Ludwig Wittgenstein had said there is no private language. We formulate our inner life in the common language. Friedrich Nietzsche argues that this language of our inner life was developed only under the pressure of the need for communication. Our organism consumes energy, requires sustenance, food and drink, is exposed to heat and cold, needs protection. As infants, we were not able to supply our needs ourselves. We needed adults, and we needed to communicate our needs to them. Thus, self-consciousness developed in the form of a language of our needs and wants. In the measure that we formulate ourselves as a bundle of needs and wants, we make ourselves dependent on things and on others. This language, Nietzsche writes, formulates the most superficial and worst part of ourselves. For a living organism is not simply a material composite, relaxed form that are experienced in the form of needs. Every living organism generates energies in excess of what it requires to search for and obtain what it needs. Needs and wants are not the core of life, they are superficial and intermittent. The core of life is the production of excess energies. Surging within, they are felt in exhilaration. Actions that discharge these excess energies without requiring anything in return. Actions that are driven by inner exaltation are, Nietzsche writes, incomparably personal, unique, and infinitely individual. They are actions driven by the compulsion and exhilaration that discharges energies generated within oneself, energies discharged on one's environment that arrays its services singularly around oneself. In formulating ourselves as bundles of needs and wants, we make ourselves subject to others, servile. We subject ourselves to demanding words, oppressive words, abrasive words, stinging words, biting words, cutting words, words that constrict us, lacerate us, humiliate us, sicken us, mortify us. The language of one's needs and wants addressed to others are formulated in the language of others, the common language. These words, too, indefinitely repeated, weaken, empty of their meaning. In order to maintain interest in ourselves, we had to concoct new metaphors: spirit, soul, child of God made in the image and likeness of God, consciousness, Dasein, being in the world, annihilation, now the brain as a biological computer. These strange new words jolt the mind and make it see itself as new and astonishing. But all these metaphors undergo the fatality of all words that get used too much. They become dead metaphors, trivialized and sterile. Cioran foresees the time when we will have exhausted the possibilities of the dictionary, and we will no longer see ourselves as something new and astonishing in the material universe, and are confronted with our life as commonplace, trivial, and boring. Formulating ourselves as bundles of needs and wants, we grasp things of the world as objects of needs and wants. This language formulates the most superficial and worst aspect of things. It passes over what whales, birds, butterflies, trees, cliffs, lakes are for themselves, what they are in themselves. Communication with things and events becomes communication with what people say about things and events. Today, when half of humanity has assembled in cities, where whenever people are not talking to others facing them, they talk into cell phones, there subsists a powerful drive for solitude. In the cities, there are people who live alone, and there have always been people who lived alone in forests and deserts, people who left clan and homeland to wander, never to return. How little we understand them. They have no explanations of their drives and longings. Our psychologists have no journals and autobiographies to scrutinize and interpret. Indeed, today's psychologists devote themselves instead to locating broken human relations in infancy and in domestic situations in order to reconnect them. There are, however, two quite different bodies of literature in our Western culture composed by those who sought solitude. There are the sayings of the Desert Fathers in Egypt and the Sinai of the 3rd century of the Common Era, and writings by their successors living in Eremitic monasteries throughout the centuries of Christianity. Beginning in the second half of the 18th century, there is the Romantic literature, writings by Goethe, Kleist, Toledan, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Hawthorne. In both these traditions, we see the compulsion to break out of the closed web of human relations in which an individual finds he or she constructs the work, meaning, and worth of his or her life in the eyes and in the judgment of other humans. These people found that they were actors in a small artificial stage, his or her life reduced to gestures and utterances, responding to the gestures and utterances of other actors on that stage. The Desert Fathers, as also the sages in Buddhism, were driven by the sense that outside of that stage there is reality, vast, uncomprehended, and unsuspected by those utterances and gestures. They fled the harmonious and beautiful forms that please to the sublime and terrible forests, deserts, and mountains, where they sensed a sacred region hovered. In the crowds and cities, as on the stage, they had felt their lives possessed by others, condensed into utterances and gestures commanded by others. Now, in the wilderness, they understood that the craving to grasp things, to possess their meanings, the egoism, had to be overcome. They had to empty the mind and soul, even of their own longing for substantiality and individuality, so as to exist as a pure welcoming of the vastness and sublimity of reality. Indeed, has not any one of us who has spent time alone in nature experienced the heightened sensibility that soon comes, and with it the fading out of one's touchy concern with one's identity, status, and boundaries? Our ears register crescendos and twangs in the murmur of night insects. Our eyes burn with the gleam and colors of Arctic ice. The Romantics also felt a compulsion to escape from the network of human relations, from the stage in which the work, meaning, and worth of one's life are constructed. But they instead pursued a unique individuality. They felt that deep within themselves are forces that on the stage are compressed into common forms, forces that are creative, both of a person's distinctive individuality and of the individuality of his or her thoughts, emotions, actions, and works. For, Robert Stoller writes, the mind is made up of innumerable fragments: mouths, breaths, beatings, postures, smells, decorations, tattoos, music, genitals, symbols, humiliation, invasions, anxiety, danger, masquerades, foolishness, disgust, hope, the dorsal but never the ventral surface of the left much more than the right earlobe. Rather than emptying themselves of egoism, the Romantics strove to discover, uncover, affirm, and release the wellspring of energies within. Yet it is striking that they too left the city for nature, for long solitary walks in forests and mountains and in foreign lands. Has not any one of us who has spent time alone, allowing free rein to his or her impulses, insights, and imagination, experienced a heightened resurgence of memories and a spontaneous development of narration about ourselves, about our lives? The Desert Fathers aim to vacate their minds and souls, to lucidly see and welcome the creativity outside, the creativity of vast seen and unseen reality. They sought the jouissance or ecstasy that opens indefinitely upon the unlimited. The Romantics aim to release the forces within themselves, to create poetry and artworks, and to create their lives as poetry and artwork. Affirming the boundaries of their identity, they also sought to produce closed, completed artworks that would not give rise to interpretation and could not be repeated. In the far south of the Bolivian Altiplano, on the base of the volcano Tanupa, we came upon a village of stone houses, all of whose thatched roofs had disappeared. But there was left one man, perhaps around 60, who had collected the abandoned utensils and tools, along with skulls of animals and different kinds of rocks and ores, in a small building, his museum of the abandoned village that had been Chaltani. And in a space on the edge of the high ground, he had brought rocks of strange color and shape and planted them with the deliberation of a Japanese landscape artist. Some he had carefully cemented into abstract totems. We lingered long in the enchanted stone garden. He had elected to live out his days alone, unschooled and ignorant of what high culture calls art, not creating for the art world, indeed not creating, but assembling the works of cosmic and geological artistry. His name is Santos Quispe. Este hombre es loco, he said. We shook his hand, thanked him, and left, without speaking with him. Perhaps because of the days we had spent seeing no trace of humans in hundreds of kilometers of private landscapes had given us an instinctual sense of the completeness and richness of his solitary life.